So in case you didn't know it, the big news at Scarborough Historical Society over the last few weeks is our purchase of Alger Hall in Dunstan. It's former Masonic Lodge, former Grange Hall, former Temperance Society Lodge. So we're very happy to have that and expand our collections from the museum right across the parking lot right into Alger Hall. And before I introduce our guest speaker for the afternoon, another project that we took on this year and brought to fruition is the republishing of the 350th book. And Carlene has brought a case of books. They're $40, and they make great Christmas presents. And Ron, did you bring some of your books? Yep, so Ron has written 4 books on cemeteries and stone carvers, so he also has brought some of his books as well. So today's program puts a spotlight on a subject that may not be familiar to many: Scarborough's Poor Farm and its cemetery. Located on the Broad Turn Road, the farm operated for about 8 decades. Our guest speaker, Ron Romano, has studied the farm and its cemetery and has written a paper on the subject that is now in our collections. For the past 3 or 4 years, Ron has been conducting tours of both Dunstan and Black Point cemeteries in partnership with the Black Point Cemetery Association and Scarborough's adult education program. He's designed and leads tours at many other cemeteries in the region. He's written 4 books and gravestone-themed books, and he lectures frequently on Maine's 19th century gravestone symbolism, materials and forms, cemetery landscapes, and the men who carved the slate and marble markers found in today's Maine's historic cemeteries. And I read his book on Bartlett Adams. It was excellent, so highly recommend Ron's books. So Ron, looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you everybody. We're going to talk about something that may not be familiar to many of you, and at the end of the talk it should be very familiar to many of you. We're going to do a slideshow, and oy, oy, oy. We're going to do a slideshow upright. How's that? A little better. So I want to just start with a thank you. The folks in the box on the left are all familiar to you. They're here at Scarborough Historical Society and have been a great help as I've done my research in both the cemeteries and in the office, visiting and looking through files that you guys have. Alicia Meyer from the town of Scarborough is always a help when I do tours at especially Dunstan Cemetery. She helps me make sure everything's lined up for that. And then Michael Bain from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. So thank you to those. So a few notes before I get started on the subject itself. A few notes regarding the site. The records that we have to go through, which are federal, state, and local records, refer to this particular site in a few different ways. Sometimes it's the town farm, sometimes it's the poor farm, sometimes the poor house, and sometimes the Alms House. And if that's not a familiar term to you, an alms house is a residence for people who are poor, aged, ill, and orphaned. And today, many people call them homeless shelters. But all of those are used for this one site that we're going to be looking at. And notes regarding the people, poor, the word poor is used throughout, refers to people who are living in poverty. Paupers are poor people who are receiving aid from the community. There are other descriptors that are, some of which are no longer considered acceptable to us, but they are included as found in the original sources. So you'll see a few of those today as well. And a few notes about the space for the burial. If you haven't taken one of my cemetery tours, you may not know that there are differences between burying grounds, cemeteries, graveyards, and churchyards. So I'm going to quickly tell you that we think about the colonial period, there were really 3 types of burials. People buried in their own backyard and on their own farms, and there was a lot of those in Scarborough, more than 80 that we know of, private burying grounds. There was a churchyard or a graveyard, which is a burial space that's associated with a church or a meeting house. So it's for the parishioners of that particular group. And a burying ground is a town space that's not associated with the church. So you would usually find in a town both burying grounds and churchyards or graveyards. And then into the 1800s, we started using the word cemetery for everything, and that's what we call all burial spaces today is a cemetery, and that's okay. But that's really a newer term than graveyard, churchyard, and burying ground. So the burying ground, again, is the town space for use by residents. A pauper's field is also a town space because paupers, as we just learned, are poor people who are receiving town aid. And if you've ever heard potter's field, there are some communities that have potter's fields. That's also a town space. The origin of that name is quite unique. It comes from Europe. There were clay quarries where potters would go and source their clay. And they would dig these big holes and leave the holes behind. And the community ultimately started to use those empty holes for graves. So it's a potter's field, and that has carried over to our side of the Atlantic, although I don't know of any potter's fields in the United States that actually were clay pits. That's just a term that came over. Okay, so we're going to do this through a timeline, and we're going to start with the earliest available town report from 1853-54. And the expenses for the town's poor in that year, that reporting period, was about a little over $800, which was 3 times the cost of infrastructure. So you can tell that as far back as the 1850s, Scarborough was spending quite a bit of money to take care of its people in need. On the right-hand side is a snippet from one of the town reports that shows you line by line how they itemized the expenses. In the first blue box, you can see James Libby was paid for funeral expenses of Lydia Skillen. Her grave clothes were $2.32. Her coffin was $4.50. Digging her grave was $2. The hearse was 50 cents, and there were personal services for $1. So the total cost for her was a little over $10, which today is about $400. So you can sort of think about the budget there. The bottom box is another example showing digging the grave for Joanne Augustin, Ivory Penny. It's actually Berry, not Penny, but they listed here as Ivory Penny for the coffin, etc. And then the bottom of that line, you'll see Timothy Bragdon was paid for shoveling the path to the burying ground. There's a clue there that Scarborough had a burying ground, which is, again, a public space for use.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
The 802, 3 times the cost of infrastructure. What do you call infrastructure?
So road work, primarily clearing roads, getting roads set up was mostly the infrastructure. Yeah, that was reported here, yeah. Yep. Okay, so the burying ground that was mentioned on that last page was actually the common burying ground at Dunstan Corner. If you look at the intersection there, you can see cemetery over on the left-hand side. That's actually the site of Dunstan Cemetery today. It's the original site. It was much smaller space than we have there today. The first burial in that area was, well over 100 years before this map was done, which was 1871, because there was a community of people living there and using that patch for burial of their families. Diagonally across from the Methodist Episcopal Church from 1839, you can see across the street the MECH, which is the church lot. So that space may have actually been used as a churchyard for a little while as well for the parishioners of that church. So again, this map is 1871. Now, one of Scarborough's people that you all probably know about, Augustus Moulton, town resident for over 30 years, and he was Maine State historian for a few years in the early 1900s. He wrote a really interesting book in 1925 called Grandfather Tales of Scarborough, which gives us a really great look into what life was like at the time of his grandfather's living here. And in that book, he talks about the old burying ground. And this is a quote from his book. For a long time, the old Dunstan Cemetery had no apparent owner or caretaker. It was used commonly for burial purposes. The town afterward purchased adjoining land and took possession of the whole as a town cemetery. So he's confirming for us that that patch was just a patch of land that people used on their own. Nobody really said they owned it. The town didn't own it. It was just for common use, like a public garden or farm or grazing space for animals. So let's look at the first census here from 1860. In that census, we have 7 people in Scarborough who are identified as paupers. And this is how a detail of the census looks. You can see that this is Samuel Guston's farm, and there's just underneath his name, Jacob Libby, John Waterstone, and Deborah Dyer with their ages listed. And over on the right, there's a notation of town pauper. So we find 7 of those in the entire census for Scarborough in 1860. These 3 all happen to be in the same household. In another household, we have Dorcas Sweetser, who was a pauper at an advanced age of 85. And then on the bottom one, you can see again 2 people identified as paupers, Abiel Harmon and Mary Clark. So they're listed there. And then the 7th one is where we face the first reality of words need to change, and they did. Priscilla Burnham was living in Shua Moulton's household. She was in her 40s. She was identified by the census taker as being an idiot and pauper. Now, today, of course, the word idiot is a disparaging and insulting term, but in the mid-century, it was actually more clinical, and it described someone who had some limited mental capacity. So it wasn't really meant to be a belittling term here. It was more of a clinical term, but today it's a little bit hard to read and accept. You can see on the census form itself the detail. They asked specifically for each census taker to identify whether the person was deaf and dumb, also words we don't use, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or convict. So they lumped these people who were sort of on the outskirts into this one grouping, and up to the census taker to decide how to categorize these folks. This is the same census for both 1850 and 60. Later on, the feds created a more detailed report entitled Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Classes. Hardly an improvement over what they had used before, certainly. So Shua Moulton, who was a farmer, a widow, she was unusual in being a woman who ran her own farm, head of her own household of 4 kids, including Augustus, who we just talked about a moment ago, who was only 12 years old at the time. That's the household where Priscilla Burnham was living at the time. You could see that same line. Freedom was Shua's husband, father of Augustus, had died in 1857. Shua never remarried. Augustus also stayed single his entire life. He and his parents are buried over at Evergreen in Portland. So as I was going through this project and looking at the paupers of Scarborough and trying to figure out where they all and who they were and where they ended up, there were a number of research challenges along the way, but here's just one to highlight the work. I had my eyes on Dorcas Sweetser and Sarah Sweetser. Dorcas was the 85-year-old pauper in the 1860 census, which I just showed you, but then she just vanished. I couldn't find a death record for her. Sarah Sweetser had been receiving town aid regularly throughout the 1850s and throughout the 1850s. She died in 1863, but I didn't find her in the 1860 census, even though she was listed for receiving aid throughout the 50s. So then I found in the 1862 to 64 annual reports this one-liner. The Mrs. McLaughlin were paid $1.50 a day to provide care plus burial expenses for Sarah Sweetser. So who are the Mrs. McLaughlin? Well, they're Martha and Mary McLaughlin. They were sisters, both unmarried and in their 60s, and living together in the home of their brother Robert and his family. So there's, on the bottom, Martha and Mary at age 68, 63. Up the line a little bit, you can see Robert McLaughlin, their brother. But take a closer look. Look who lives right next door. Dorcas Sweetser, 85. This is the aha moment. It's the same person. This Dorcas and Sarah Sweetser were exactly the same person. One of them we have receiving aid through the 50s and then missing. One of them we didn't have, but then we see her passing away and receiving aid. So her name was probably Sarah Sweetser or Dorcas Sweetser, with her middle name being the other one, and some people called her one, some called her the other. But it's not a mystery anymore, it's actually the same person. So that's aha. So in the Selectmen's 1864 town report, expenses for the poor had grown to $946, and they identified 11 individuals and 2 families receiving town aid. They also put this note in the town report, and I'll read it for you. In this connection, your board would earnestly recommend the purchase of a suitable farm, whereupon the poor of the town should find a home at a greatly lessened expense. Adams Merrill has offered the town his farm for the sum of $3,600. In our minds, a very low price for a farm of so good quality as his, and we are confident that with a poor farm, the expense of keeping the poor would not amount to half the sum yearly expended, provided some suitable person should have charge of the same. So they were really seeing the costs of taking care of poor people in town and saying, you know, there's a way we can make this work. And other communities in southern Maine had alms houses set up, town farms set up, where people were residents there, getting care from the town, but participating in, you know, taking care of the farm, producing goods for sale. So Scarborough wanted to do the same thing in 1864, recommended Adams Merrill, but Adams Merrill kept his farm. So they maybe didn't come up to a good price. 1866, sad end for one of our residents here. There was a note that $23 had been paid on behalf of D. Richards, including burial, so I just knew that there was somebody named D. Richards who had died that year. But then a year later, there's another note. $2 had been paid for assisting at the coroner's inquest for Daniel Richards. So that immediately makes me wonder, why would there be a coroner involved in this situation unless there was some real issue? And in fact, it is a sad end. Daniel Richards of Scarborough was a single man, age 54, took his own life by hanging. He had been subject to fits from his youth, which caused partial derangement. It is supposed that the deed was committed through the fear of being sent to the insane asylum in Augusta. The coroner had been called, but after investigating, deemed it unnecessary. So this tells us that we've got people who are without money, who are dealing with mental illness and other issues that are being taken care of by the town, and the alternatives for Mr. Richards especially was not, in his mind, a good one, and it ended up leading him to take his own life, sadly. So in 1866 to 67, Betsy Moody, who was listed as a town pauper, Linda found in her ephemera files some nice snippets here that I'm using. Payment for Betsy Moody's grave clothes. You can see on that top one, it says grave clothes $450 for Betsy Moody, paid. On the bottom, $3 was paid for digging her grave. We have, once she was dead and buried, the town sold her goods. They received $33.50 for the sale of her cow and hens, and then $14 more for her personal property. So once somebody was a poor person who was receiving aid from the town, when they died, the town took their assets and sold them. And the trustees gave a friendly reminder in the 1866 report. This is again 2 years later. The town had budgeted $2,000 for support of the poor. So we're seeing the prices, you know, the expenses going up, and suggesting they raise it to $2,500. So they were really looking at a lot of costs going out. And they said, and we would especially recommend that the town purchase a farm for the support of the poor, as we are convinced the town would save a large portion of the pauper bill. This time it worked. So on March 16th, 1867, the town of Scarborough purchased the James and Harriet Brackett farm, which is shown here in later years. There was a home on the site, some outbuildings, 125 acres of land, and they spent $2,800 for that, which roughly is $112,000 today. Still a bargain, because you can't even buy a driveway for $112,000 anywhere near us today. This photo is from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission's 1994 survey, so it is a later photo, but it shows the house and the attached garage barn. So in the paper that I wrote about this whole thing, I moved next to saying that I see this as an all-hands-on-deck reaction by the citizens of Scarborough. The 1868 town report documents about $2,000 paid to over 40 people in town to basically outfit the house. So there was a lot of people involved in getting this Alms House set up once it was purchased. More than 50 lines of detail, and this is just one page from the report, so you can see cows, sheep, pigs are all being purchased, bedsteads, crockeryware, bedding, feathers, furniture, tools, all of that is being purchased by the town from all these folks in order to make sure that the Alms House is equipped for handling the paupers who are going to be moving in there. And what came as a result of that change in the town's ownership of a building now, or an Alms House now, is the reporting also changed. So helpful to me in doing research, most of the categorization of expenses and income were split. So we had provisions furnished to the poor at the Alms House, and bills contracted and paid for poor out of the poorhouse. So we had some people who were living at the poor farm and were fully taken care of, while there were other people who were living in private homes but still needed help. And the town was furnishing help to them in other ways. And so they get categorized on that second one. And then just a second example, easier to understand. Expenses of the poor at the farm, expenses of the poor off the poor farm. The first keepers of the Alms House here, the town farm, were Thomas and Eliza Carter. The documentation shows that T.C. Carter and wife were paid $300 as overseer's salary for the first year. They kept the farm from 1867 to 70. They did have children, but they were all born after they had left service as overseers of the farm. Thomas lived till 1882. This is his stone at Dunstan. You can see he's the third one down, Thomas Carter. The C is actually in there as well, but it's obliterated by lichen right now. Eliza, his wife, remarried Jarvis Bond a couple of years after he died. So what you're looking at is a granite stone at Dunstan, but it's the side panel of a stone. He's listed secondarily to his wife. Here's the front. So Jarvis Bond, the second husband of Eliza, is listed here, and then Eliza, his wife, with her dates, and Emma. But again, on the side, Bond was nice enough to allow Thomas Carter, her first husband, to be documented as well. Note that although Jarvis Bond did die, he had to have been, because it was 1848 when he was born, and there are other people who died into the 1900s. Nobody ever finished his death date. It's just a blank space. So I'm happy to tell you that we know when that was. If I was a stone cutter, I would have carved that in, May 15th, 1914. But for now, it's just computerized. So now we're back to the timeline here. 1867 was the first burial at the town farm cemetery. So they had a farm. It was a big space. If one of the paupers died, they needed to bury them somewhere. They set up a patch of land just beside the farm in order to take the remains of the paupers who died on site. Deborah Dyer, who we've already met, died in 1867, so she, I believe, is the first one to have been buried at the town farm cemetery. She'd been under the town's care at least back to the 1853. She was 77 and listed as a pauper in the 1860 census, and I think she was related to John Waterhouse, who also shows up in all the reports and the census records. They're linked in both 1850 and 60, and you can even see in the town report, there's a list of help paid to these folks, but each one's individual except it's for Deborah Dyer and J. Waterhouse. I cannot find a family link to them. They were 35 years of age apart, and they are always connected in both census and town reports. So there was something there that I haven't been able to discover. But there were 4 others who died shortly after. So before 1870, there were people living at the farm who were also dying at the farm and being buried at the farm. 1869, the interesting case of Mary Parker. The town had paid $14 to the S.S. Rich Company of Portland for a coffin for her, and then went to Westbrook to retrieve that money because they felt that's where that her husband would be responsible for it. The ad on the right is from the S.S. Rich Company in Portland. It just shows you that they were in business selling caskets and coffins and metallic caskets and other things. So the town had spent some money. They thought Westbrook should pay because of her husband, but didn't work out. So the first action they took, this is Scarborough, was brought for the support of Mary Parker, alias Mary Dyer, who was married to Parker, an inhabitant of Westbrook. But upon careful investigation, it was evident that Parker, at the time of his marriage with Mary Dyer, had a legal wife. Therefore, Scarborough withdrew the action. So, there you go. So here's the 1870 census for Scarborough. You'll see Ivory Berry is listed as the keeper of the poor farm, or I might say house. Yeah, poor farm. And Areline, his wife, is listed underneath him. They're in their 20s. 3 of their children are there as well. So they're living at the farm, and there are also 4 paupers living in that household. You can see their names: Honeywell, Newcomb, Burnham, and John Waterhouse, once again, with their ages. So they've stopped calling them paupers and convicts over here. It's just deaf and dumb, you know, insane and idiotic. So it's still not great, but they're at least moving along. Yeah?
I noticed that his wife is called a matron.
Yeah, matron of the house.
So that would have been the cook and the caretaker.
Yeah, they saw them both as caretakers, although in this period, the men got the money, they were listed as the overseer, and rarely do we see, you know, money being paid to being the matron, even though she probably worked her butt off as equally as he did in keeping the house, growing kids, keeping the house going, the whole thing. But yeah, she was listed as matron, whereas the first time it was just his name and wife, and that's all it said, yeah. So where, oh where is Samuel Plaisted? This is from 1870. The second action taken that year by the town, legal action, against Buxton was support of Mr. Plaisted, who had been maintained by Scarborough for a couple of years. They felt that it had been an expensive endeavor, and once the pauper, Plaisted, had died, they proposed to Buxton to pay them $145, which they accepted, and they all walked away. Samuel Plaisted was shown in the records as being a recipient of Scarborough Town Aid, but it always said belongs to Buxton by his name. So we know he was a Buxton resident for some reason over here. He died at the poor farm January 1st of 1870 of consumption, which was a common illness going around at the time. Scarborough sought a total of $375 from Buxton to get reimbursed for the care they had given. And Buxton had its own poor farm at the time of his death. And I talked to Buxton about it. They can't confirm that they took the body back for burial. And so we don't know for sure. He probably is with us in Scarborough still due to the settlement. So we're at 1871, and this was a great time for map making in our communities. Scarborough map from 1871 shows the blue dots, which I've added to the map, by the way. That's not the map. That's not the way the original map looks. The blue dots are private burial sites known in Scarborough. Janice Mikowski and Dorothy Libby, many years later, have identified more than many more of these, like double the number. So there were a lot of them. I think there was 80-something private burial patches in Scarborough as of this date. The black circle is the town farm and the graveyard just above it. And then the first circle that's kind of brownish is Dunstan, and down on the bottom is Black Point. Okay, second keepers of the house were Ivory and Areline Berry from 1870 to 1872, but they came back a few more times. They were the 8th and the 10th keepers as well. They'd been married in 1864 and were the only people to serve over 3 decades. So they were partly in 1870, part in 80, part in 90, coming and going. Ivory became the overseer at age 24. They worked a total of 12 years over their 3 spans. They had 5 kids, all of whom reached adulthood, which is kind of rare at this point, and the kids lived at the farm with them. They're buried, Ivory and Areline are buried over in Buxton. Once again, what's going on? They didn't finish the line. His name is way over on the right instead of centered. I don't know why they did that. So it's Ivory Berry over on the right. It should be centered. And then the date is just 1928. So I didn't fix that one with the computer. I've lived with it the way it is. 1872, Mrs. Fenderson was thrown upon the town the 1st of November by her son, Tracy Hughes of Saco. A suit of her maintenance has been commenced against him to recover the amount expended, $40. Mrs. Fenderson had been receiving aid and continued to receive town assistance from Scarborough until her death in 1876. Her son was a harness maker, a Saco alderman, a councilman, a fire warden, and a prominent temperance advocate. I think he had plenty of money to take care of his mother instead of throwing her on the town of Scarborough. But the clue to me, and it's pure my brain working, the fact that he was a prominent temperance advocate makes me wonder if his mother had an alcoholism problem and he threw her out, and that was what it was. So I don't mean to pass that diagnosis on to any of the Hughes or Fendersons. It's just my idea, but I don't know why he wouldn't have wanted to take care of his mother instead of throwing her on to Scarborough. And at the same time in 1872, Mr. Ballard shows up. A man by the name of Ballard was carried to the Alms House the 1st of February, sick, and lived only 3 weeks, no relatives. Nothing else is known about him. And this is kind of a classic thing that happens in the pauper community. These are people who are, for the most part, just left to their own devices and not with family. And so this guy showed up in town, sick. We went to the Alms House because there was no other place to bring him, and he died, and they buried him. But nobody knows more about him, so we can't connect him to family. 1875, Julia Graffam and her daughter. So Julia Graffam was also carried to the farm early in the season in a delicate state of health. She continued to decline and after a few months died. The delicate state of health is suggesting she was pregnant, and that shows up in the next line. Her infant child was bound out to Benjamin Richards soon after her death, but survived only a few weeks. And another key note for research, there are now only 5 permanent inmates at the farm. So we know that there's not a lot of people living at the Alms House. It's just a handful at a time. But I think she was a single mother. They brought her to the Alms House. Child did not survive. Benjamin Richards and his wife, he was a railroad worker, had 2 children of their own, but they had lost them both in infancy. So they were childless at the time and agreed to take on this infant child of Graffam. She died very soon after as well. And the question that I have that I'll never know the answer to is, where did they bury that child? Did they pay to have her buried at some lot in their own family patch, which I have not found, or did they return her body to, to the town farm where Julia Graffam was buried? They might have put the two, reunited the two of them in death. I don't know. 1877, the town did a survey of the burying yard. This is the Dunstan burying yard. By this time, you can see that there was some organization to the place. There were some rows here and equal patches along the way. So they started to really get a sense of it's time for the town to take this on as the town's first public space. And so that's what they did. They named it Dunstan Cemetery. It was the town's first public cemetery. Charles Rounds was paid $3 to put up a fence. Adjoining land was purchased to increase the footprint. Bulletins were printed by the town regarding the availability of lots. And we know that Lewis Walker paid $10 for one and Cyrus Moulton paid $20 for two. They were among the very first to buy lots in the new space. And people began to move bodies in, lots of bodies. What happened here was because the town had decided to embrace Dunstan as its public cemetery, it encouraged townspeople to shut down their personal farm patch lands. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. In the earlier days, people have huge tracts of farmland, and as the population grows and they get more kids and they want to have farms too, they want to parcel that land, or they want to sell some of that land off, or many of them were wanting to move to the Midwest where there was great hope for a new future. And so a way to get rid of the bodies laying around in your yard is to move them to the town cemetery where they're going to be taken care of forever, and then you've got free land that you can parcel out or sell or whatever. So it's not an unusual thing that people close down their personal cemeteries and move people over to Dunstan. In fact, it was happening all over the place in the 1800s. I'll take a sidestep from Scarborough for a minute, bring you to Portland, where I live and do work at Eastern Cemetery, which is the oldest cemetery in Portland. That's Portland Peninsula. During the pandemic, when I was sitting around twiddling my thumbs, I took on a project to try and identify all of the bodies that were removed from Eastern Cemetery in the latter half of the 1800s. I have over 700 people known to have been originally buried at Eastern, but removed elsewhere, including 550 to Evergreen, which was our big garden cemetery, some to Western, some to Forest City, and another 75 to a variety of cemeteries around the area. Note the quote up on the right from 1616, William Shakespeare's gravestone epitaph reads, "Cursed be he that moves my bones." Well, 250 years later, they're moving bones like nobody's business. Hundreds all over the place.
Were those bones in coffins, one of those homes?
Yeah, so it depends on how long the body had been there and what the burial was at the time. At Eastern Cemetery in Portland, we had a number of people who were buried in coffins, the six-sided, very tightly fit, boxes. But we had many people who were just wrapped in a shroud and buried in a cloth. And so, depending on that, the level of deterioration and how long ago they've been buried, sometimes there's dust to move. But, the colonial grave practices were nothing like today. There was no such thing as a concrete vault at 6 feet under. People simply they dug a hole as deep as they needed to get the body in the ground. And if they could afford a box, they would. If not, they would wrap them in, in cloth, a winding cloth. So it really depends, but yeah, some of them would have come in boxes, but others would have just been literally, bones or dust. So here's a couple of examples for you of people that moved from Portland out to Scarborough. So this is a vital record for one of the Southgate kids. You can see the circle, place of burial, Portland at Eastern Cemetery. Now he died in 1852 of typhoid fever. He was only 17 years old. Henry was the 15th child of Horatio Southgate, 9th of Horatio's third wife, Eliza Neal. Horatio, the patriarch, was born and died in Scarborough, but had spent many years in Portland as a successful and prominent attorney. So he moved there to do his career, came back to Scarborough, and had kids, all over along the way with his 3 wives. So in Eastern Cemetery, Horatio Southgate co-owned tomb number 61 with Joseph Cotton Boyd, who was shown, who was Maine's first state treasurer. So they purchased, where that Veterans Monument is, just behind that is the tomb site that the 2 men had co-owned. And a half a dozen of the Southgate kids were first entombed there in Portland and then moved out to Dunstan. So here's the monument at Dunstan. It's a beautiful one. It was made in Portland by the team of Hunt and Jewett, who were Portland marble workers from the mid-century. Mostly marble, but this is a sandstone monument. It's quite nice, actually. Horatio had 2 adjoining lots at Dunstan and was laid to rest there with many members of his family. Son Henry and others were taken from Eastern and brought over, and there are 13 identical markers that line the double lot. You can see the orientation of the stone here. Just look to the left, you can see there's 4 or 5 stones that all look the same. Those are 6 or 7 of the identical ones. And then there's another set on this side of that monument as well. That's always on my tour. So if you come on my tour next spring of Dunstan, we'll take you there, because I know you're going to want to do that. Here's a second example. People who moved to Scarborough. Rufus Emerson's vital record from 1849 notes he was buried in Portland, but this obelisk in his name is signed Rummery and Hanson, marble workers from Portland, and they were in partnership only from 1860 to 63. So we know when this was made, just a couple years from when he passed, the obelisk and the bodies came from Eastern out to Scarborough. Okay, so just to show you that map that was done in the 1870s, the double Horatio Southgate lots are there in the bigger circle, and then over on the right is the Emerson obelisk, so they're in the same line. Town vital records from 1878. If you look at the line that has the arrow here pointing to it, it's just to show you an example of the original town of Scarborough vital records. Handwritten, 1878, February 20th, Abiel Harmon died at Alms House, aged about 78 years. So they did try to differentiate in the vital records when somebody died, if they were on their farm or, or the poor farm. 8 are known to have died at the farm in the 1870s, as I said at the bottom. Okay, we're up to the 1880s. The overseers are now Fanny and William Seavey, siblings, not spouses. Fanny was born first in 1841, William in 1845, both unmarried, both in their 40s. They were the 9th to serve, and they ran the farm for 2 years. His title was overseer, hers was matron, but this time she received separate pay from the town. So I think because they weren't married, they gave them each an allotment of money. These are their markers. They're side by side at Dunstan Cemetery in a family lot. Okay, by 1890, Ivory and Airline Berry had returned for the 3rd time. They had their 4-year-old son Grover with them. Their other 4 kids were adults and out of the house. The farm had strived to be financially self-sufficient through the sale of its products. So these folks that were living there were producing products, pumpkins, potatoes, milk and eggs, and livestock. The best year that I could calculate for them yielded 83% return. So they, for example, spent $1,000 but made $830. So they never really broke even or made money, but they got pretty close. Yep.
How did people come to be there? Were they forced? Did any of them just want to be there?
Yeah, I don't think they wanted to be there. I think, and I don't know if they were really forced to be there. I think it might have been families and the community realized when somebody was in dire circumstances, without a home, without a job, without money, and needing assistance. And because the town was taking care of people outside the farm, they could assess who really needed a living space as well. So if a farm person if a farm owner wasn't willing to take somebody into their own home and take care of them, if they didn't have any relatives, for example, they're likely to end up at the Boer farm as long as there was room. Yeah. Yep. So by 1890, 18 had died at the Alms House with presumed burial at the farm cemetery. And the first, one of them was one of the farm's longest term residents. So you can see in the arrowed boxes here, Charles Roberts was paid to bury Priscilla Burnham. You'll remember she's the woman I showed you at the beginning who had been listed as the idiot and pauper living in the Moulton home. So Priscilla Burnham and William Jose died the same year. And then also on that line, George Thurston was paid to minister the funerals of both of them. So Priscilla Burnham lived from 1813 to 1890. She was labeled a pauper in 3 censuses for Scarborough, under care of the town for over 30 years, lived with the Moultons, and became one of the first residents of the farm. Interestingly, markers for 2 of her brothers are at Dunstan. So you can see Harris Burnham, her brother, and Joel Burnham, her brother, both have marked graves there. And of course, as a pauper, she don't. Simple line in the 1892 report really helps to drive home the change that's about to come here. George Thurston, a town selectman and overseer for the poor, was paid for, quote, removing pauper bodies to the cemetery. So the pauper bodies are on the farm. Now we have a line showing that he's being paid to remove them to the cemetery being the town cemetery of Dunstan, certainly suggesting that the town is deciding to end its use of the Poor Farmer Cemetery. And that nail gets driven further into the coffin, pun intended, on the next line, where for the first time in any town report, we find a charge paid for express charges for the body of someone who had died at the farm. So they're categorizing that Elizabeth Dodd died at the Alms farm, and they expressed her. They paid to have her body removed elsewhere. And that happens right after they've removed bodies from the cemetery, from the town farm to the cemetery. It makes perfect sense to me that what's going on here is the town has said, we're going to shut that down. Dunstan is now open. We're taking care of Dunstan. We don't need to take care of 2 different cemeteries. Let's move the bodies in, and from now on, bury people at Dunstan Cemetery. So the Poor Farm Cemetery is closed. Her body had to go elsewhere. We don't know whether it was into Dunstan or somewhere else. The next person who died at the farm actually has a vital record naming Dunstan as the place of burial. So it's one more thing proving this is what's happened. We've closed the cemetery down at the farm, and people are now being buried at Dunstan.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You're getting most of this information from annual reports and so on. Wouldn't there have been a town vote to do this sort of thing?
A town vote?
I mean, wouldn't somebody make a motion to close the...
I mean, I don't know. I'm looking at all the annual reports that are issued, and if there's a second document somewhere that talks about town meeting votes, is there? I mean, I'd love to see them.
I don't know.
Oh,
I was asking you.
yeah, I don't know of any, but Dawn, where's Dawn? Oh, over there. Is there any such as animal?
Not that I've ever seen.
Yeah, okay. So we rely on the best we have. Okay, so to me, there seems to be little doubt. The town farm cemetery closed in 1891. Bodies were removed from the farm and reinterred at Dunstan, and those who subsequently died went directly to the Paupers field at Dunstan Cemetery. Let's fast forward to just get through the timeline here. 1925, there were no residents living at the farm anymore, and the farm's expenses were really low. So the farm is no longer as useful to Scarborough as it used to be. In 1953, the farm was sold to Smith Grant. He's shown on the right. He'd been farming the area for 20 years, so he knew the property, he knew the area, and he was a farmer. When he died in 1977, his son Ralph inherited the property, and then in 2002, the farm was dismantled and the land was redeveloped into 50 homes, which are there now off Broad Turn Road. So having served Scarborough's poor for 85 years, the town farm was history. So let's do a few last slides here. The permanent residents from 1875 to 1900, so the last quarter of the 19th century, you can see that there were never very many people living at the farm. It was not big enough to house a lot of people. Portland's Alms House in the very same time period was housing 80, 90, 100 people a day. It was a huge venture. And there are other almshouses and town farms in the community that also had a fair number of people. Scarborough's was always 4, 5, 6 in general. There was one year they had reported 11 people living at the farm, but a bunch of them died and it brought the number right back down again. So year-end reports, you can see 7 was the highest, 2 was the lowest, but it was generally 4, 5, or 6 people at a time living there. By decade, I was able to put together a grid to show who died in what decade. You can see that there's a half a dozen in the 1860s, from 1867 on. 1870s has a few more, 1880s, and then 1890s only through 1891, which is when I believe the town cemetery, the farm cemetery is closed. So we have 20 people who died at the farm, were likely first buried there and moved to Dunstan, and an equal number who died of paupers, who died off the farm and likely buried in the burying ground. And then a few more grids here. Town deaths in the 1890s. The light blue is the total number of deaths in the town of Scarborough. The dark blue is the number of paupers. So what you can see is pauper deaths compared to total deaths. It's only 3% of the total. It's most are non-paupers, and a handful along the way here. So if you're driving up Route 1 or down Route 1, you can see at the bottom there, the main gate at Dunstan today, as you drive in, on the right-hand side, you'll find the Paupers field. It is a big empty space for the most part, but there are some family lots that are scattered in there. So that's the spot where I believe these folks all ended up. And here's a photo from the driveway looking in. You can see that there's room for a few hundred graves here. I've calculated from other cemetery surveys that we can put about 1,000 people in an acre. And so there's easily a few hundred spaces available there. Many of them are taken and unmarked because paupers didn't get gravestones. So summarizing this, some summary thoughts. Clearly there are some leaps of faith in my work, and there are some lingering questions as well, but the conclusions make a lot of sense given all things considered. I think it's the story that I'm telling, and I think it's a pretty good story. Scarborough, we can feel good about this. Scarborough cared for its people, living with poverty, lack of housing, mental, physical disability, and abandonment. We know that from looking at how much they were spending every single year in the town budget. On the other hand, we don't feel great about the fact that some of these folks were simply sent away to the farm and forgotten. A lack of vital records and newspaper notices and unmarked graves all just bury their names. We don't know who they are, we don't know who they were linked to, and they don't get the same treatment as others in the community. In the paper that I wrote, I ended it with this quote from David Eagleman. You may have heard this or some form of this before. There are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. And the third is that moment sometime in the future when your name is spoken for the last time. Now, I kept that in my brain when I was writing my book, up in the upper left, about Portland's Eastern Cemetery, which is a colonial cemetery back to 1668. And we have, everybody who lived in Portland for the first 200 years was buried at Eastern Cemetery. Rich, poor, black, white, everybody. And there are some fairly well-known people who are there. But when I wrote this book, I specifically focused on the ordinary people, like Dorcas Louie, who was a 45-year-old African-American woman who was found frozen to death in a snowbank in front of her house. She had gone out drinking that night, she didn't make it home, and she died on her doorstep, basically. And Horatio Noyes, who was a 14-year-old kid, on Christmas Day, snuck into the church, climbed the tower, he got up 70 feet and fell to his death. And his grave is at Eastern Cemetery. These are people that you would never hear their names because we've forgotten them. You'll hear about Preble and Asa Clapp and the Longfellows and all that, and that's good. But what I wanted to do was to shine a spotlight on the people who are not as well known, the ordinary people who ended up there. So I start every chapter of that book with a snippet about somebody who was an ordinary person, like Dorcas Louie, like Horatio Noyes. And this project has really brought me back to that because we're learning about people that many don't know and wouldn't know a lot about. And I wrote this paper, that's the cover of it. The copy is in the Society collections if you want to read the whole paper. But further thinking here is that we can give these people a voice, and there's a few ways to do it. One of them is to write a paper, check, give a talk, check, do walks at the cemeteries, check. I just did one at Dunstan yesterday and we talked about this. So I'm saying their names, and that's what I'm doing here. A second way is to create Find a Grave listings for these people. So if you don't know Find a Grave, it's a really good crowdsourced site where people can plug in pictures of grave markers they find at cemeteries, and then you can make links to family and the whole thing. What I've done is I've created 38 listings at Dunstan on the Find a Grave website for the 38 people that I believe died at the farm and were removed there, or paupers that were sent there as well. And so this is what a typical Find a Grave listing looks like. It names the person with their birth date, death date, where they're buried, plot number, and I call it Paupers Field. And then I put the picture of the field on that as well. And then I put vital records on, and then I tell the story. We don't know much about this person, but what we know is they were at the, receiving town aid, and they were in this census and whatever. And I tell the whole story, and then I say at the end of these listings, if anyone has information to add to this story, just be in touch with me and let me know. It's easy to do that. So I want people who may have these folks in their family to say, wait a minute, I know something about them. And that'd be great if it happens. But they're already done. There's 38 of them out there, all at Dunstan Cemetery. And then the last thing is to consider maybe doing an interpretive sign and memorial at Dunstan. We could do like a panel, upper left like that, a simple panel that just says, this is the site on the burial of paupers, people, unfortunate people whose lives came to an end in Scarborough at the town farm and are relocated here, and we could name them or not. You can do a monument, you can do a plaque, you can do other kinds of things, a memorial garden, whatever. There's opportunities here for us to say their names further if we all want to do that. And that's the end. So thank you for listening to the talk. Hopefully see you next spring at the cemeteries. I'll be back at both Black Point and Dunstan, spring and fall, doing tours. You can find them through the Scarborough Adult Education program or in the newsletter of the Society. And I'd love to take questions if you have them. Yes.
I wouldn't think that there would ever be the idea of planting, or putting more people into there, because presumably you can't identify exactly where each of the bodies is buried. I mean, how could you possibly put more people into that area unless you know exactly where the current bodies are.
Right, but in fact, they are doing that. So the town still uses that Paupers field for the placement of bodies of unknown, homeless, et cetera. So the most recent burial that I'm aware of was about a year and a half ago for a young woman who was in dire situation, very young woman. She gave birth to a child. As a single mother, the child died, and she had no means to do anything, and the town buried the infant at the Paupers field. So it is still active as a Paupers field, but it's not like all the time people are being brought in there. And I don't know for sure if the town has a certain section that they know is free of graves or not, because if they're unmarked. But you know what happened at Portland's Eastern Cemetery in our Paupers areas is literally you would dig a hole, and if you hit a box, you go to the next space. I mean, sometimes with unmarked graves, there is somebody there, but you don't know until you dig. So yeah, they still are using it for that. There's not a lot of burials that go in there, but it's still active. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nowadays, they use ground penetrating radar at some expense to figure out,
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's
Thank you.
actually, this space
sense.
at Dunstan is actually a really good space for ground penetrating radar because it's so flat. You really, because what you have to do is like a lawnmower, you go back and forth, and it reads. On these bumpy hillsides and stuff, it's hard to do. But yeah, I mean, if they wanted to, they could do that. Yeah. But yeah, it's still active. Yep. Other questions? Good. Thank you.
Thank you.